Hello, this is my Valorant agent tier list for 2024. I'm going to specifically look at solo queue, and I'm going to look at like two criteria: how strong they are, and also how impactful they are to actually play, like what you actually get out of it. So for learning the agent. First one is Breach, and Breach is pretty weak. You don't really get too much from learning him, and also he's just low skill floor, low skill ceiling. You don't really get much value from actually playing him in the actual game itself, and you don't get much from learning him either. You get like kind of how to interact with your teammates, how to set them up for success. And aside from that, you don't really get much. He's just very one of the weakest agents in the game. Next, we've got Brimstone. Brimstone is a pretty basic agent. He doesn't take much to learn aside from his smokes, which makes him quite good for learning smokes themselves because the rest of his kit doesn't require much to learn. So his smokes are really strong not really strong, but like his kit's really good to like learn the actual skills for smokes. So things like how to do like the best team smokes, or how to do like the best individual smokes to get kills, or like how to get advantages in the round with like non-conventional smokes potentially. And I think that's Brimstone's like strength for actually playing him, where you can kind of learn that stuff without having to learn another kit such as Omens or Vipers. Next we've got Cipher. Cipher is very much on theme. He has a pretty good kit that plays towards knowing where the enemy is, or like understanding macro to a point where you can kind of understand enemy movements and pathing. Things like tripwires are good about understanding enemies' pathing. Obviously, they're super easy to kind of understand and the way that people play right now, but generally you can do like mix-ups that can like interfere with enemy pathing and things, like putting a trip in random position, in like a position from mid, or like switching it up to garage on Haven or something, and Haven's rotated out, it's probably not the best example. But aside from that, his ult is also conditional, so it's not very great because it requires a dead person, a dead enemy. But that kind of plays into his team because it basically tells you that to get his ult off, you need to understand that you need to understand like how to get an isolated fight and that kind of stuff, at least in theory, right? And I think that's pretty much in theme with him. And I think in general, like he's going to help you understand macro. I also don't think I think he's a pretty good agent anyway. So I do think he's a pretty good agent and worthwhile to play. Next is Jet, and I'm going to put Jet and Raya together. The reason why is because they basically both of them are really good at telling you how to entry. Raya is definitely a bit more high skill ceiling, while Jet is a bit lower skill ceiling. Just because of Raya's, maybe not ceiling necessarily, but floor for sure. Because satchels do have like a bit of a learning curve to them, so definitely skill floor is a bit higher for Raze. She also does have a bit more macro stuff to talk about, a bit more like team-wide stuff to talk about. Things like using your nade off your teammate is also off your teammates like util and things is quite important and quite good. Generally doesn't have any of that sort of stuff, but she does have like the most basic way of entering. She also has the free first fight, so she's quite strong when it comes to the actual game itself, and also how you also learn the importance of how to taking a free fight as well. Is probably one of the most important things to learn on her as well, and where to take that fight and that kind of stuff. When to take that fight sometimes as well. When we go back to Raze as well, there is also a very minor thing with like understanding animation cancelling with her ult and her satchels. That stuff could be very useful later on if we ever have another agent that has animation cancels. Next is Omen. Omen is really good for understanding smokes, as Brimstone is, but he also has some other stuff to do with like time cheating, position cheating, whatever you want to call it, with his shredded step and his ult, where he can try and cheat time with his ult. But the main parts, cheat time with the ult and his shredded step, the main parts with those things though is understanding what you'll actually get out of it. Things like rotating for the enemy doors with your ult, or maybe getting closer to a teammate to actually make a play with them with shredded step. That kind of stuff is really important to understanding the value of these abilities. And I do think that he is a pretty decently strong agent, although if I would just talk about strength alone, I would put him in B tier, but because he's actually a pretty strong agent to learn the game on, I do want to push him up to A tier. I also think that the paranoia is pretty decent to talk about with your teammates, so you can like basically learn how to create set plays in games with him. Next we've got Phoenix. Phoenix is a pretty good agent to learn the game on as well, sometimes for newer players, as it kind of has ult is like a free fight, so it can help you kind of build the confidence. You also want to prioritize getting that ult, so it's going to help you ask for teammates util to take orbs. Also on top of that as well, Phoenix is really strong the lower you go then on the ladder, basically, because his flashes are a lot more undodgeable as they used to be than they used to be. And because of that as well, he tends to get tends to still fall off towards the later portions of the ranks. Because those ranks tend to be better at predicting the fact that he might flash out in certain positions and positioning accordingly. And I do think that he's really strong in solo queue to kind of get through those early ranks. But as time goes on, you should probably start to move on to other agents that maybe have a bit more benefit to them. But the Blaze Wall is also quite nice too to learn some stuff as well. Things like pressuring, using like lack of information, so you can give the enemy a lack of information by blaze walling across the site. And then either using that to make an advantage or like to make a play to get an advantage, or to just not use it in the conventional way and fake the pressure. That kind of stuff is quite like, I would say it's quite light on Phoenix, but it's also quite good to get started on Phoenix like that, I think. To kind of understand that and then use it on other agents that actually require it, or might not necessarily require it, but could use it to a bit more of a larger extent. Next we have Sage. Sage is unfortunately not very strong. She has 2 situation abilities in her heal and her res. I won't talk about too much Sage right now because I've talked about her at length before in other videos. But generally I think she's quite weak with the situation abilities she has. Her 2 other abilities are quite good, but they require a set of, I would say, learning, understanding to actually use, especially the wall. The wall requires a lot more macro understanding than I think people realise to actually play it correctly. Although I do think as well, there is times where you can just freely place the wall, you can improvise the wall, and it's quite impactful. The slows themselves are pretty easy to use. Isolating fights, slowing down enemies. It's very, very on the nose with the way you use it. But I do think she has some value to learn at the start of when you start playing. She's also quite I would say she's like a very beginner, persuasive, or like she's like very attractive to new players in a way that she's just like is like the healer, right? And a lot of people like to play that kind of support role because they feel like they're not good enough to play other roles. Quick thing there, you probably are good enough to play other roles in other games. But yeah, so Sage is like attractive to new players in that sense. Then we've got Sova. Sova is building his playbook a lot of the time, and also understanding when you actually should not be using your playbook in some ways too. So he does have that like external skill where you're going to be building a playbook and a set of lineups for him. And don't get me wrong, all the agents will have a playbook, but Sova's definitely one of the agents that extremely show that you need one, and especially to new players. Well, definitely to new players. And I think he's quite strong. So the reason why I put him in A tier is here. He's quite strong through most of the phases in the game. There are situations where he obviously isn't strong in that phase of the rounds, but he is quite strong generally. Post plant is his most obvious one, where he's going to be able to use recon and drone to reveal people that are trying to get onto sites or make set plays with his team, and then pressure the bomb diffuser with his ult and with his shocks. So he is quite strong in post plant with that kind of stuff. But that's not the only reason why he's strong. But I do think he helps to learn that sort of stuff with like off-site post plant, and learning playbook, and like learning a playbook or like building a playbook. And then I do think as well, later on, as you start to learn him more, you'll also learn the importance of neglecting your playbook in certain situations to have superior positioning for the situation you're in. I do think that helps. That will help. Sova will help you learn that skill eventually. At least when you get kind of like the inkling that, like when you start to actually learn the game macro-wise. Then we go to Viper. Viper is probably the strongest agent in the game currently. She can mix up smoke timings. She just generally has a strong kit overall throughout a round. She has the ability to lurk. She's basically going to give you a lot of ways to learn different parts of the game. Being a smoke, being like a smoking agent, being a lurker. You have to interact with a lot of different things in the game. And you have to learn quite a few different things to be genuinely good at this agent. But yeah, I do think overall, she's a strong agent. I won't talk about it too much because I think everyone kind of knows she's a strong agent. Let's go on to Raina. Raina, I've got her in C tier. Usually I would actually put her in D tier. The reason why she's in C tier is because I think if you're genuinely better than the people in your elo, she's probably going to be a decent agent to play because you're going to be able to snowball rounds. The problem is that is as a prediction that you're better than the enemy team, or better than the people in your elo, is one that you can't make very confidently unless you're like smurfing, basically. So what I would say is that I wouldn't play Raina unless you're smurfing, basically, or unless you have fun with it. Obviously, this game, it's a game, right? You're meant to have fun playing this game. But when it comes to her actual strength, she's pretty weak. She doesn't really provide a huge amount. Her Leer is probably the strongest thing about her. Her Dismiss is also quite strong too. Actually, yeah, her dismiss is probably the strongest thing about her. Actually, thinking about it, but her leer is not that bad. Because it can be used to extend enemies, your teammates' flashes or util, right? To extend the impact of those pieces of util. But I think generally, I wouldn't play her because you're not really going to learn a huge amount playing her. But if you're going to have fun with her, then go for it. That's completely fine. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend playing her. I'm going to get a hate for that, but sure. Killjoy is next. She fell off a tiny bit for me. She was S tier, now she's A tier. I think generally she is a pretty strong agent still, but I do think she fell off a tiny bit with the changes. I think she just has a lot less. She has a couple less setups that are available to her now, and I think overall when it comes to learning the game, I think she still provides a lot. She provides a lot in post plant. Her ult is very unique in a lot of ways where she can kind of show the importance of clearing space, and she create very unique situations that you would have to learn to be good at the game. And then as well, she also is a lurker, so she has a lot of things like interacting with the enemy's macro. Her ult as well is also good at interacting with the enemy's macro as well, with delaying them in doing what they're doing, just messing up the enemy's playbooks as well, messing up the enemy's strategies. She's really good at doing that kind of stuff with her ult. Next we have Skye. Skye is a pretty strong agent too, so she's an S tier. She has got weaker slightly, but I still think she's S tier. She has probably one of the weaker abilities in the game with Overgrowth, but aside from that, she has really strong abilities. She's able to be a solo slot initiator, where she can basically be the only initiator on her team and still provide enough value as an initiator to allow for that. So you can allow for double sentinel or double smokes. So she's really strong in that sense. With her dog being basically a really good drone replacement. Did get a bit worse, but I think it is still good enough. The flashes are really strong. Information and flash in one makes her really strong. And her ult is probably the strongest ult in general case in the game. Just good no matter what almost. Obviously there are better times to use it and worse times to use it, but generally it's really good to have and really good to use. Yoru is interesting to me because I think he's probably the best agent to play in the game for learning, and the best agent, and I wouldn't say he's necessarily strong. I think if you're really good at him, he can be really strong, and I think he has a lot of potential to be really strong and just take over lanes. But I also think that takes a lot of skill, and is not, as a result, it's not always going to be consistent when you take over lanes. So I do think that he's probably one of the best agents to play in the game, to learn the game. He interacts with being a duelist, so he interacts with getting his own kills. He interacts with being an initiator, so he interacts with his teammates and how to get them kills. And then he also interacts with the macro of the game with his TPs and his clone as well. In some cases, do interact kind of a bit with macro in some ways by tricking the opponent into doing things, and you can activate it from across the map, etc. So I do think he has a really good kit for understanding what the enemy wants to do, a lot of the macro play, a lot of the solo getting a kill type plays, a lot of the team based getting a kill type plays. He's overall a good agent to play to learn the game. Even though he does have his own individual learning curves to go through, I think if you are able to stick it out and play Yoru, he's definitely the best agent to play. I'm not even a Yoru main, by the way. I do think that is actually the case. Next is Ashe at B tier. Generally, I'm not going to go over that too much with Ashe. He just requires a lot of communication, and generally, you're going to be learning how to communicate with the team, how to set up plays, and that kind of stuff. That's not the main part of her. As a result, that kind of makes her weak in solo queue. So that's the reason why she's kind of in B tier. She could arguably be in C tier, to be honest. But I think strength-wise, she's not that bad. Or at least I think she's pretty good. It's just that she kind of gets dragged down by the fact that solo queue is solo queue. Next we have KO. KO, once again, is also an agent. I think requires a bit of teammate understanding and communication. With scanning areas and saying which areas you haven't scanned, which can be clear or aren't clear or whatever, right? Because he does have a bit of nuance with where you put your knife and what you're actually scanning can be quite impactful to the rest of your team. So you need to get good at communicating that sort of type of stuff. He's also quite good as well when combined with good teammate util, which is not always the case in solo queue. So because silencing enemies is going to extend the value of your util because they would have no access to theirs. So for instance, probably the most obvious example of this is if you Killjoy ult and then you KO ult or you KO knife the Sova, then the Sova can't ult it. That's probably the most plain example of how KO can extend the value of another player's ultimate or another teammate's utility. So he does have a lot of facets to him there as well to learn. He has all the initiator stuff with like how to make unpredictable flashes, how to mix up those timings with the flashes, and he has a decent, I would say decent in quotations, like post plant. You don't really want to play him like that, but you can technically play him in post plant in some ways. I would say for the most part, he's good at showing you on post plant that you should actually play like on site and like try and delay for the people that play off site, and you can kind of play on site and like be annoying to the enemy team that are trying to retake. So it delays enough time so then the people off site can play the post plant the way they want to play it. Like I think he's also really good at showing that type of post plant play too. Let's go on to Chamber. Chamber have got on B tier. So the reason why he's higher than Raina, because even though I do basically treat these agents fairly similarly, they don't really provide too much to learn. The reason why he's up one is because he just takes a free fight at the start of the round, which is really, really good on solo queue. And that's basically it. Overall, he doesn't really, and he does give a tiny bit more to learn, like some economic stuff with your headhunter, like not overbuying util and that kind of stuff, or like, yeah, that kind of stuff. It can kind of like, you get like marginal things to learn on him. You also get some marginal things like layering with sentinels, which is like a decent like thing to like understand, but it's not too difficult to understand with other agents anyway. So next we got Neon. Neon is C tier for me, and she's quite weird actually, because the higher up you go, the more important it is to learn her macro stuff, because she can cheat time on a small scale or a long scale with the running, but it's only really impactful for like her version of like getting timings and the way that she can mix up timings as a duelist, and specifically only as a duelist, unfortunately isn't really that impactful. Anything where she's actually strong. And then when she's in the higher ranks, when that cheating timings like that, the way she does it is impactful, she's actually quite weak with the rest of her kit. So she's in a very weird limbo where the stuff you learn aren't going to be impactful until she's weak. So it's kind of weird, and I don't really like the way that that kind of works. Obviously, in like, I'm not going to talk about competitive play a whole lot. I haven't talked about it at all really. But in competitive play, obviously she can see play because of the way she does that, and the way that you can support her in a way that makes her strong enough to really use those timings that she can get. But the problem is like in solo queue you aren't going to get that type of support. Next we got Fade, and I'll just shorten what I was going to say about Fade into, she's basically short range Sova, where she can get a lot more value in the close range with the prowlers, and obviously she has limited range with her other stuff. And she gets more value as like a teammate as well with the C's than Sova does. And so she can help you kind of learn, aside from like, basically she can help you learn what Sova kind of learns with like the playbook stuff. But she also helps you kind of learn how to play with teammates a bit more, with like the C's and the prowlers kind of helping teammates take space, and the ult as well. The ult also has its own thing where you deafen people, so therefore you can kind of help like Yorus take space that make a lot of sound with their util. Same with like Omens that TP as well. Raise nades will be silent when coming at people, when like flying at people. So she has like some nuance to her that you can kind of learn to use with other agents, which is quite cool. Next we've got Harbor. So all these agents I've put in B tier, and the reason why these four are in B tier is because they are fairly unique with the way they operate, and in solo queue that can be quite difficult to manage. So Gecko is probably the most likely one to be useful in solo queue, but basically because that the way that he used his nuance is like constant timings, right? He has more uptime for his utility, and so you kind of have to understand like ability timings with him, but you don't have to understand it too much. Like you don't have to actually use his utility to the extent. Obviously, that does make him weaker in total, like in overall, but you don't actually have to understand that for solo queue for him to be good in solo queue, I think. And I do think that he's pretty decent overall. I think his Dizzy is kind of still weaker than I think it should be, but I think he's still quite good. I think he's still overall quite good overall. But the reason why he's in B is because I just don't think like you're really going to be learning him to the extent you need to learn him in solo queue. Next we have Harbor. Once again, I don't think you're really going to be learning him to the extent you really would want to learn him in solo queue. I think Harbor is actually probably one of the better agents in the game. But in solo queue, he's a lot harder to play. You have to communicate with him properly. You have to learn the wall stuff. And that wall stuff can take time to learn, not only mechanically, to get the proper lineups and to move your mouse at the correct timings to get the proper walls. But on top of that as well, you need to make sure you don't make pockets. You need to make sure you're communicating those pockets. So you do have to do a lot of things on him, and there is a lot to learn. So that's really good for Harbour. The problem is that he's just a lot weaker than a lot of other agents are in solo queue. And that's partly the reason, because that he's got so much to learn and so much to communicate. But, you know, he's not terrible. I do think he's quite good. I actually do like all 4 of these agents. And I do prefer, I would like them to be higher. But I do think that they, in general, for the general player base, they aren't going to go higher than B. At least for now. Deadlock recently got changes. And I do think that she's underrated. She was underrated back then. And I do think she's a tiny bit underrated back right now. But I do think that she does have a very big learning curve. And I do think that you will be rewarded for being good at Deadlock. Eventually. I do think that she's maybe a bit too much on the weak side right now, and I do think she requires a bit of communication, a bit of teammate understanding with the wall and the barrier. So she is quite difficult, and I do think that she has like quite a few things to learn on her that can be like she does have to interact with macro quite a bit as well with her wall, understanding when to place the wall, understanding like where the enemies are going to path, that kind of stuff. And she has some nuances with her wall. Her sonic sensors are the same. Like, you have to kind of understand when they're going to take fights, when the enemies are going to make sound. So she does have like quite a few things to interact with macro. I do think she's quite a good agent to learn. But I do think you might need to wait for a bit more balance changes to come to her and maybe make her a tiny bit more strong. But generally, I do think she is pretty good still, in a good state. ISO is the newest agent, so I have a lot less information to talk about with him overall, as I haven't really played him a huge amount either. But the parts that I can definitely talk about are the theory stuff, which is more to do with, I would say, overall his ult. His ult is very much like a macro-centric thing where you can try and identify the solo player and then tell your team to go take that space while you ult him, basically. That is like a really basic part of ISO. A really important skill to have is to understand the macro, so then you can make that play. And that's kind of it, I think, for the tier list. That's it for ISO. I'm not really going to talk about ISO too much. I'm not sure exactly where he stands strength-wise either. I think he is basically a tiny bit better than Raina on a team-wide scale. He provides a tiny bit more than that. Whether that's actually better for solo queue, not 100% sure if he's actually better. He definitely has less snowball potential, and he takes less safe fights than Raina does. So I think overall, like, he's kind of maybe a tiny bit better for learning the game, but worse overall than Raina in some situations that are important for solo queue, like getting kills. So yeah, I think ISO strength is probably fine around B tier. I'm probably going to hate for the Raina one, but that's fine, and maybe the Neon. We'll see. Thanks for watching. Send in my tier list. I didn't take too long, only 23 minutes in. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in my next one. Goodbye.